Cook County Jail sits on the west side of Chicago, sprawling across more than 96 acres of concrete, steel, and controlled silence. It is one of the largest single-site county jails in the entire United States, processing tens of thousands of individuals every single year. People arrive there for reasons that span the full spectrum of human darkness: drug trafficking charges, murder indictments, organized crime conspiracies, racketeering, terrorism-related offenses, weapons charges, and crimes so severe that the weight of them changes the air inside a courtroom. Some of the men who passed through its intake process were street-level offenders caught in the wrong moment. Others were architects of criminal empires so vast and so deeply embedded in the fabric of Chicago that their influence did not stop at the jail door. It continued through visitation rooms, coded correspondence, and networks of loyalty that no set of handcuffs could fully sever. If you are new here, welcome to Justice Docket. This channel exists to tell the stories that demand to be told, carefully, responsibly, and without flinching from the truth. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. For those of you who have been here, you already know what we do. Now let us get into it. What makes Cook County Jail historically significant is not just the volume of people it has held. It is the caliber of individuals who sat inside its divisions, while the city outside debated their guilt, mourned their victims, and in some cases, quietly feared their release. Mob bosses, gang commanders, contract killers, and men whose decisions shaped the trajectory of entire neighborhoods all passed through the same intake process, were photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a number. Inside those walls, power did not disappear. It adapted. It found new channels. It moved through whispered conversations in visitation rooms, through letters written in language only insiders understood, through the kind of authority that does not require physical presence to remain real and felt on the streets outside. Chicago has always been a city of layers. On the surface, it is architecture and culture, music and ambition, a skyline that announces itself against Lake Michigan with unmistakable confidence. Beneath that surface runs a different history entirely, one written in court transcripts, federal indictments, crime scene photographs, and the quiet grief of families who never fully recovered from what these men set in motion. This is the story of 5 of the most consequential criminals ever connected to Cook County Jail. Their crimes range from bootlegging and organized murder to contract killing, mob deception, and decades-long gang command. Together, they represent what happens when ambition has no boundary, when violence becomes policy, and when one city absorbs generation after generation of organized destruction. Al Capone. Al Capone was not simply a criminal, he was a system, a fully operational machine of violence, corruption, and calculated power that swallowed the city of Chicago whole during the 1920s and early 1930s. Born in Brooklyn, New York in 1899, Capone migrated to Chicago, where he found fertile ground for ambition with no moral ceiling. Prohibition had made alcohol illegal, but it had not made people stop drinking. Capone recognized that gap between law and desire and turned it into an empire. He did not stumble into organized crime. He studied it, absorbed it, and then improved upon everything he inherited from the men who came before him. He arrived in Chicago at the invitation of Johnny Torrio, a senior figure in the city's criminal underworld who recognized in the young Capone a combination of intelligence, fearlessness, and organizational instinct that was rare even in that environment. Torrio had been building a criminal operation in Chicago for years, but he needed someone who could enforce discipline without hesitation and expand operations without losing control of the details. Capone was that person. When Torrio eventually stepped back following a near-fatal assassination attempt, Capone inherited the operation and immediately began transforming it into something far larger and more sophisticated than anything Chicago had seen before. Prohibition had taken effect in 1920, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol illegal across the United States. The law was ambitious, the enforcement was not. Millions of Americans had no intention of stopping their drinking simply because Congress had passed an amendment. Bars went underground. Speakeasies multiplied across every major city. The demand for illegal alcohol was enormous, consistent, and enormously profitable for anyone willing to supply it without fear of consequence. Capone was not just willing, he was built for it. He built an industrial-scale bootlegging operation that manufactured and distributed illegal liquor across Chicago and beyond, supplying speakeasies, private clubs, restaurants, and individual buyers through a distribution network that operated with the efficiency of a legitimate business. But alcohol was only the foundation. Beneath it sat gambling dens, brothels, loan sharking rackets, extortion networks, and protection schemes that bled terrified business owners dry. If you operated a shop, a restaurant, a laundry, or a trucking company in Capone's territory, you paid. The payment was not optional. Refusal was met with escalating consequences. Windows were shattered first. If resistance continued, the response became more permanent. By the mid-1920s, his organization was generating millions annually. Historians have estimated that, adjusted for inflation, the revenue would reach into the hundreds of millions of dollars by today's standards. This was not street-level chaos held together by fear alone. It was a corporation with structure, hierarchy, specialized roles, and a ruthless internal discipline that punished disloyalty as swiftly as it rewarded performance. The corruption network he maintained was not incidental to his operation, it was central to it. Police captains were on his payroll. Judges received envelopes. City officials looked away from evidence that would have been impossible to ignore without financial motivation. Chicago was not simply suffering from organized crime during this period. It was governed by it in significant ways. Raids were tipped off in advance. Court cases evaporated. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia. The system that was supposed to contain men like Capone had been purchased by the very man it was meant to stop. The violence that enforced his dominance was not random. It was strategic. Rival gangs who challenged his territorial control were met with overwhelming force. Drive-by shootings became a feature of Chicago street life during the 1920s. The North Side Gang, led by George Bugs Moran, represented his most persistent and dangerous rival. The conflict between Capone's South Side operation and Moran's North Side organization escalated through years of targeted killings, retaliatory shootings, and open warfare conducted across the streets of a major American city. Neither side was willing to concede territory. Neither side was willing to negotiate a lasting peace. The conflict could only end one way, and Capone intended to be the one still standing when it did. The tension reached its most infamous and brutal expression on February 14th, 1929. 7 members of Moran's gang gathered inside a garage on North Clark Street. They were expecting a liquor delivery. What arrived instead were gunmen, some dressed in police uniforms, who ordered the 7 men to line up against the brick wall. What followed lasted only seconds. More than 70 rounds of machine gun fire tore through the 7 men at close range. The bodies collapsed onto the concrete floor. The garage walls were shredded with bullet holes. One man survived the initial shooting long enough to be found by police, but died shortly after, refusing to identify his killers. Capone was in Florida at the time, a deliberate alibi constructed to place distance between himself and the massacre. No indictment ever followed. No witness ever testified against him for the killings. But in the public consciousness and in the understanding of every law enforcement official in the country, the St. Valentine's Day massacre bore his signature. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from today. We have viewers joining from all across the country and beyond, and it always means something to know who is in the room. Also, what is the weather like where you are right now? Let us hear from you while we continue. For several more years after the massacre, Capone continued to expand and consolidate his operation. He cultivated a public image with calculated precision, funding soup kitchens during the early years of the Great Depression, presenting himself to struggling Chicago residents as a man of generosity and community spirit. Photographers captured him smiling at charity events. He gave interviews in which he described himself as a businessman, simply meeting public demand. Some people believed it, or at least found it convenient to believe it. Behind that image, the violence continued. Informants were killed. Disloyal associates disappeared. Enforcers carried out targeted assassinations with the quiet efficiency of men who understood their work as a profession. Federal authorities had grown increasingly frustrated by their inability to prosecute Capone for violent crimes. Witness intimidation worked. Evidence disappeared. Juries were compromised. Local law enforcement was too deeply corrupted to be reliable. So prosecutors made a strategic decision that would change the outcome entirely. They stopped chasing murder charges and targeted money instead. For years, Capone had lived with extraordinary visible wealth. Custom suits, luxury hotels, expensive jewelry, lavish parties, and a lifestyle that broadcast financial success to anyone paying attention. He had never filed a federal income tax return. The government built a meticulous financial case, tracing income from illegal operations through ledger books, testimony from associates, and documented evidence of spending that could not be explained by any legitimate source of revenue. In 1931, Capone was indicted on 22 counts of federal tax evasion. When he was brought into Cook County Jail during the proceedings of his trial, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The man who had controlled Chicago through fear and corruption was now processed like any other defendant. Fingerprinted, photographed, assigned a number. He initially believed he could manipulate the outcome as he had manipulated so many proceedings before. He fundamentally misjudged the federal resolve and the character of the judge assigned to his case. Judge James Herbert Wilkerson refused to honor any lenient arrangement and demanded a full trial. During jury selection, concerns about bribery were so serious that Wilkerson made a dramatic last-minute decision, swapping the entire jury panel with one from a different case, preventing Capone's team from influencing the final composition. The jury deliberated for 9 hours before returning a guilty verdict on multiple counts. On October 24, 1931, Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, one of the harshest sentences ever imposed for tax evasion at that time. The financial penalties exceeded $50,000 in fines, with an additional $215,000 owed in back taxes and interest. He was transferred to Alcatraz in 1934, where the isolation dismantled his remaining leverage systematically. There was no corruption network to activate, no loyal enforcers within reach, no Chicago streets to command. At the same time, his physical and mental health collapsed. The syphilis he had contracted years earlier and never properly treated advanced into neurosyphilis, a condition that attacks the brain and central nervous system. By the late 1930s, his cognitive function had deteriorated significantly. He was released in 1939 after serving roughly 8 years, his sentence reduced due to deteriorating health. He retreated to his estate in Palm Island, Florida, no longer feared, no longer relevant to the streets he had once controlled absolutely. He died on January 25, 1947, from cardiac arrest. He was 48 years old. The city he had terrorized did not mourn him, but his name never left Chicago. It attached itself permanently to the history of organized crime in America and to the understanding that even the most powerful criminal empires carry within them the seeds of their own collapse. Harry Alleman. There are criminals who announce themselves. They crave visibility, cultivate reputations on street corners, and measure their power by how many people flinch when they walk into a room. Harry Alleman was not that kind of criminal. He operated in the opposite direction entirely, away from cameras, away from headlines, away from any attention that might complicate his work. He was a contract killer for the Chicago outfit, the organized crime syndicate that had dominated Chicago's underworld for decades. And his value to that organization rested entirely on his ability to do what needed to be done without leaving traces that led back to leadership. He was not a boss. He was not a strategist sitting at the top of a hierarchy making broad decisions about territory and revenue. He was the instrument those bosses reached for when a problem required permanent resolution. Law enforcement came to know him by the nickname The Hook, derived from his surname, but fitting in ways that extended beyond wordplay. When the outfit needed someone removed, Alleman was the man they hooked that responsibility onto. He carried it without hesitation, without public display, and without the kind of emotional residue that made other killers unreliable over time. In the world of organized crime, that combination of discipline, discretion, and willingness made him extraordinarily valuable. It also made him extraordinarily dangerous in a way that differed fundamentally from the gangsters who generated headlines. His danger was quiet. It arrived without warning and left without witnesses. To understand Harry Alleman fully, you have to understand the Chicago outfit and the culture it operated within during the 1960s and 1970s. The outfit was not a street gang. It did not spray bullets indiscriminately across neighborhoods or engage in the kind of open territorial warfare that characterized South and West Side gang conflicts. The outfit operated through infiltration. It embedded itself inside legitimate structures, labor unions, construction companies, trucking firms, restaurant supply chains, and political offices. It controlled revenue streams that appeared entirely legal on the surface, while extracting money through extortion, skimming, and coercion beneath that surface. Violence existed within the outfit's operational model, but it was targeted, authorized, and designed to send specific messages to specific audiences. William Logan was a Teamsters union official operating in Chicago during the early 1970s. According to federal prosecutors, Logan had made the catastrophic error of moving money in ways that the outfit had not sanctioned. In the rigid financial hierarchy of organized crime, unauthorized movement of funds was not treated as a minor infraction. It was treated as a betrayal, and betrayals within the outfit carried a standard consequence that had been applied consistently for decades. Logan was lured to a Chicago apartment in 1972 under the pretense of a routine meeting. The details of what happened inside that apartment were methodical and without theatrics. Logan was shot multiple times at close range. He died at the scene. The killing bore every characteristic of a professional hit. No unnecessary violence beyond what was required. No evidence left carelessly. No witnesses positioned to identify the shooter. It was clean in the way that only premeditated, experienced violence can be clean. Harry Alleman was arrested and charged with Logan's murder. The prosecution believed its case was solid. Witnesses had placed Alleman in proximity to the victim. Physical evidence supported the timeline prosecutors had constructed. The state moved forward with confidence, expecting a conviction that would remove one of the outfit's most reliable enforcers from circulation and send a message that even mob hitmen were not beyond the reach of Cook County justice. What happened instead became one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of judicial corruption in the United States. In 1977, Harry Alleman stood trial for the murder of William Logan and was acquitted. The jury returned a not guilty verdict. Alleman walked out of the courtroom a free man, and for years that appeared to be the end of the story. He resumed his life openly. He attended social gatherings. He maintained his relationships within outfit circles. He was not hiding or living cautiously. He had beaten a murder charge in open court, and in the world he inhabited, that kind of outcome was understood as proof that the system could be managed. What the public did not know, what could not be proven at the time, was the reason for that acquittal. The presiding judge in Alleman's 1977 trial was a Cook County judge named Frank Wilson. Years later, during the sweeping federal investigations into judicial corruption that rocked Cook County's court system in the 1980s and 1990s, the truth about that trial emerged with devastating clarity. Judge Frank Wilson had accepted a bribe of approximately $10,000 to manipulate the proceedings and ensure Alleman's acquittal. The fix had been arranged through outfit intermediaries who understood that corrupting a judge was a far more reliable strategy than intimidating witnesses or tampering with evidence. Wilson had not simply looked the other way. He had actively shaped the trial's outcome in exchange for payment. When he was eventually confronted with the evidence against him, he confessed. The acquittal that had freed Harry Alleman had been purchased. Now, before we continue, we want to hear from you. Based on what you know so far, do you think the legal system in Chicago during this era was beyond repair? Or were cases like this the exception rather than the rule? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This is exactly the kind of conversation this community was built for. Share this video with someone who needs to know this story. For the legal system, that confession created a problem of extraordinary complexity. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution contains the Double Jeopardy Clause, one of the foundational protections in American criminal law. It states that no person shall be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. In practical terms, this means that once a defendant has been acquitted of a charge, the government cannot retry them for that same crime, regardless of what new evidence emerges afterward. The protection exists to prevent the state from using its vastly superior resources to wear down defendants through repeated prosecutions until a conviction is obtained. It is a cornerstone of constitutional fairness. But prosecutors made an argument that had never been tested in American courts before. They contended that the double jeopardy clause only applies when a defendant has genuinely been placed in legal jeopardy, meaning when they have faced a legitimate proceeding with a real possibility of conviction. If the trial itself was a fraud, if the outcome had been predetermined through bribery before the first witness was ever sworn in, then the defendant had never truly been in jeopardy at all. The acquittal was not a legal finding. It was a purchased result, and a purchased result, prosecutors argued, could not be shielded by constitutional protections designed to prevent government overreach in legitimate proceedings. The argument was unprecedented. Defense attorneys fought it aggressively through multiple levels of appeal, arguing that the double jeopardy clause was absolute and that allowing a retrial under any circumstances following an acquittal would fundamentally undermine one of the most important protections in the Bill of Rights. The courts examined the argument carefully and at length. Ultimately, they sided with the prosecution. Because the original trial had been corrupted beyond any reasonable definition of a legitimate legal proceeding, it did not qualify as genuine jeopardy. Harry Alleman could be tried again for the 1972 murder of William Logan. In 1997, 25 years after William Logan was shot to death in a Chicago apartment, Harry Alleman stood trial for that murder for the second time. The proceedings were conducted under intense scrutiny. Legal scholars followed the case closely because its outcome would establish precedent about the boundaries of double jeopardy protection in cases involving judicial corruption. Prosecutors presented testimony about the structure of the Chicago outfit, the culture of sanctioned violence that governed its internal discipline, and the specific circumstances surrounding Logan's death. Witnesses described how hits were authorized, how targets were selected, and how men like Alleman functioned within the organizational hierarchy. The evidence was detailed, methodical, and overwhelming. Alleman was convicted. He was sentenced to 100 to 300 years in Illinois State Prison. The sentence reflected not just the gravity of the murder itself, but the extraordinary circumstances of a case that had required the legal system to confront its own corruption directly and find a path through it without abandoning constitutional principles entirely. For Cook County, the conviction was a moment of institutional reckoning. The revelation that a judge had accepted a bribe to free a mob hitman exposed how deeply outfit influence had penetrated the courthouse. It was not just that criminals had corrupted police officers or intimidated witnesses. They had corrupted the judiciary itself, the final line of institutional accountability. Harry Alleman served approximately 12 years of his sentence before being released in 2006 due to advanced age and deteriorating health. He died in 2020. His story does not fit the template of the flamboyant gangster whose crimes generate dramatic headlines in cultural mythology. He was quieter than that, more disciplined, more deliberately invisible. But the case he left behind reshaped American legal understanding of what double jeopardy protection means when the system it is designed to protect has itself been compromised. The murder of William Logan took seconds. The legal consequences of that murder and the corruption surrounding it took 25 years to fully resolve. And the precedent established by his retrial continues to stand as one of the most significant intersections of organized crime and constitutional law in the history of American jurisprudence. Willie Lloyd. Willie Lloyd did not build his reputation on a single act of violence or one defining moment that announced his arrival to the streets of Chicago. His reputation was built over decades, layer by layer, through a combination of organizational discipline, territorial dominance, and a capacity for survival that defied every reasonable expectation. He was a commanding figure within the almighty Vice Lord Nation, one of the oldest, largest, and most structured street organizations in Chicago's history, and he rose through its ranks during one of the most volatile periods in the city's modern crime history. To understand what Willie Lloyd represented, you first have to understand the world he rose inside of, because that world did not produce leaders casually. It produced them through fire. The almighty Vice Lord Nation did not begin as a criminal enterprise in the conventional sense. It was founded in the late 1950s inside the Illinois State Training School for Boys in Sheridan, a juvenile detention facility where young men from Chicago's most impoverished neighborhoods were confined together and forced to navigate survival in an institutional environment. What began as a protective alliance among incarcerated youth evolved over the following decades into one of the most expansive and hierarchically sophisticated street organizations in the United States. By the time Willie Lloyd came of age on Chicago's West Side, the vice lords had fractured into multiple factions: conservative vice lords, traveling vice lords, four-corner hustlers, and others, each operating with relative autonomy but sharing foundational codes, symbols, and a chain of command that connected them to the broader organization. The West Side of Chicago was their primary territory, and that territory was defended with a seriousness that translated directly into bloodshed whenever boundaries were challenged. Willie Lloyd was born in 1957 and grew up immersed in that culture from an early age. The West Side neighborhoods where he came of age were defined by concentrated poverty, inadequate housing, limited economic opportunity, and the constant presence of gang structures that offered young men identity, income, and belonging in the absence of viable alternatives. Lloyd demonstrated early on that he possessed the qualities that the vice lord hierarchy valued most. He understood organization. He understood loyalty and how to enforce it. He understood that power in that environment was not simply about personal toughness, but about the ability to coordinate people, manage resources, and project authority consistently enough that others deferred to your judgment without requiring constant demonstration of force. He moved upward through the ranks steadily until he occupied a position of genuine command within the organization. His rise to prominence coincided directly with the crack cocaine explosion that reshaped Chicago's West Side during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The introduction of crack cocaine into urban markets across America during this period generated an economic transformation in the underground economy that was as dramatic as it was destructive. Crack was cheaper to produce than powder cocaine, faster acting, and generated a pattern of addiction that created consistent, repeat demand. For street organizations with existing territorial infrastructure and distribution networks already in place, the crack market represented an enormous revenue opportunity. The vice lords, like other major Chicago gangs, moved aggressively into that market. Corners that had previously generated modest income from other criminal activity became high-volume distribution points generating thousands of dollars daily. The money was real, it was substantial, and it attracted the kind of violent competition that turned entire neighborhoods into contested ground. Under Willie Lloyd's leadership, West Side drug corridors operated with a layered discipline that law enforcement described repeatedly in court documents and intelligence reports as deliberate and organized. This was not informal street dealing conducted by loosely affiliated individuals. It was structured distribution with defined roles, assigned territories, internal accounting, and enforcement mechanisms that punished deviation from organizational rules swiftly and severely. Corners were defended with firearms. Rival organizations that attempted to encroach on vice lord territory were met with armed resistance. Internal violations, skimming money, cooperating with law enforcement, violating territorial boundaries without authorization, were punished in ways that reinforced the message that the organization's rules were not suggestions. Revenue moved upward through a chain of command that connected street-level dealers to mid-level supervisors to leadership figures like Lloyd, who oversaw the broader operation and made decisions about territory, discipline, and organizational direction. Law enforcement pressure on Lloyd and the vice lords intensified throughout this period. Federal and state investigators built surveillance operations targeting his communications and movements. Informants within the organization provided testimony about internal structure and operational details. The picture that emerged from those investigations was of an organization that functioned with a sophistication that went well beyond what casual observers associated with street gangs. There were titles, ranks, and responsibilities. There were rules about how disputes were resolved and consequences for those who violated them. There were financial flows that moved through multiple layers before reaching leadership. And at the center of that structure on the West Side was Willie Lloyd, whose authority was described by investigators as both real and consistently enforced. Then came 1992. Rivals who understood that removing Lloyd would destabilize Vice Lord operations on the West Side made their move. Lloyd was shot multiple times in an ambush that was clearly designed to be fatal. The attack left him paralyzed from the waist down, confined permanently to a wheelchair. In virtually any other context, that level of physical devastation would have ended a leadership position immediately. In the world of Chicago street organizations, where physical strength and the ability to project personal force were deeply embedded in the culture of authority, a paralyzed leader was expected to lose his standing quickly. Willie Lloyd did not follow that expectation. He continued to command from his wheelchair, issuing directives through trusted intermediaries, maintaining his position through a combination of deeply established loyalty, the organizational infrastructure he had built over years, and the sheer symbolic weight of having survived an assassination attempt that would have killed most men. In Chicago gang culture, survival builds legend. The fact that Lloyd had been targeted, shot, left for dead, and had returned to command rather than retreating sent a message through the organization and to rivals that his authority was not contingent on physical presence or personal invincibility. It was structural. It was relational. It was built into the organization itself in ways that a single act of violence could not dismantle. Additional attempts were made on his life over the following years. Each survival reinforced the nickname that had attached itself to him within Vice Lord culture. King of Kings. The title was never formally bestowed through any official ceremony or organizational decree. It was earned in the way that titles in that world are always earned, through demonstrated endurance under conditions designed to produce elimination. If you have been watching Justice Docket for a while, you know that we do not just tell these stories, we examine them. So here is a question for the community. Willie Lloyd continued to command a major street organization from a wheelchair after surviving multiple assassination attempts. What does that tell us about the nature of power in organized crime structures? Is it personal or is it institutional? Leave your analysis in the comments. And if this episode is giving you something to think about, like this video and help us reach more people who want to understand these stories at a deeper level. Federal and state authorities eventually built a case that they believed was sufficient to remove Lloyd from any position of influence permanently. In 2001, Lloyd was convicted on federal drug conspiracy charges. Prosecutors presented evidence that he had supervised narcotics distribution networks responsible for moving substantial quantities of cocaine and heroin across Chicago's West Side. Testimony described how territory was enforced with violence, how the chain of command functioned in practice, and how Lloyd's authority shaped operational decisions at multiple levels of the organization. He was sentenced to life in federal prison. The sentence was designed not just to punish the specific crimes charged, but to sever the connection between Lloyd and the organization he had commanded for decades. Even behind bars, investigators maintained that his influence over Vice Lord operations did not immediately dissolve. His name continued to carry weight within the organization. Younger members who had grown up under the structure he built continued to reference his authority. The institutional culture he had shaped persisted beyond his physical removal from the streets. That persistence illustrated something that law enforcement and criminologists had observed repeatedly in cases involving long-tenured gang leadership. When an organization has been built around a central figure for long enough, that figure's influence becomes embedded in the culture of the organization itself, in its codes, its hierarchies, its sense of identity. Removing the person does not automatically remove the influence. It simply changes the form that influence takes. Willie Lloyd died in federal prison in 2015. His nickname, King of Kings, was never official. It was earned in a culture that measures power by how long a man can hold it under pressure, how many attempts to remove him he can survive, and how deeply his authority becomes woven into the fabric of the organization he commands. The West Side of Chicago during his years of dominance experienced persistent gun violence tied to territorial warfare, drug saturation that devastated families and communities, and cycles of retaliation that claimed lives across generations. The Vice Lords were not the only force shaping those conditions, but they were a central one, and Willie Lloyd was a central figure within that force for longer than most men in his position survived. Joey Lombardo. Joey Lombardo was one of the most deceptive figures in the history of Chicago organized crime. not deceptive in the way that most criminals are deceptive, through lies told to investigators or false alibis constructed after the fact. Lombardo's deception was architectural. It was built into his public persona from the ground up, maintained consistently over decades, and deployed with a precision that suggested he understood something fundamental about how power survives in environments where visibility is a liability. He was a senior capo within the Chicago outfit, deeply embedded in labor racketeering, extortion, and casino skimming operations that funneled millions from Las Vegas back to Chicago leadership. But what made Lombardo uniquely dangerous was not the crimes themselves. It was the performance he constructed around them. Reporters and observers who encountered Lombardo in public settings, in courtrooms, on sidewalks outside federal buildings, at hearings where his name had surfaced in connection with serious criminal allegations, consistently described the same experience. He was bizarre. He was theatrical. He rambled. He made statements that seemed disconnected from the proceedings around him. He exaggerated confusion about basic questions. He performed a kind of cheerful, disorganized eccentricity that made him appear, to casual observers, like a harmless old man who had somehow wandered into a serious legal proceeding by mistake. Federal authorities and prosecutors who had spent years building cases against the Chicago outfit knew better. The performance was deliberate. The confusion was manufactured. The man behind the act was a disciplined, calculating operator who had survived decades inside one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in American history, precisely because he understood that appearing ridiculous was far safer than appearing powerful. His nickname was Joey the Clown. He did not resist it. He leaned into it. He understood that a nickname suggesting harmlessness was an asset in a world where the alternative was being perceived as a threat, serious enough to warrant aggressive federal attention. The clown persona gave him room to maneuver. It created uncertainty in the minds of observers about whether he was truly a significant figure or simply a colorful, peripheral character whose reputation had been inflated by law enforcement narratives. That uncertainty was useful. It bought time. It complicated prosecutions. It made witnesses less certain about what they had actually observed, and it allowed Lombardo to continue operating within outfit structures long after many of his contemporaries had been removed through prosecution, violence, or death. Joseph Lombardo was born in 1929 on Chicago's Near West Side, in a neighborhood where the boundaries between legitimate working-class life and organized crime were porous and frequently crossed. He grew up in an environment where outfit figures were visible presences, where the organization's influence over local businesses, labor unions, and political structures was understood as a feature of the landscape rather than an aberration. He absorbed that environment and eventually became one of its most significant products. His entry into outfit operations came through the traditional pathways of street-level criminal activity, small-scale extortion, collections work, and the kind of enforcement tasks that demonstrated reliability to senior figures who were always evaluating younger men for potential advancement. He rose steadily through the outfit hierarchy over the following decades, accumulating influence and responsibility in ways that were deliberately kept below the threshold of public visibility. His primary areas of operation centered on labor racketeering, a field in which the outfit had maintained deep roots since the 1920s. Chicago's labor union landscape during the mid-20th century was extensively infiltrated by organized crime. Union pension funds were treated as accessible pools of capital that outfit figures could borrow from, invest through controlled channels, and skim from with the cooperation of corrupted union officials. Construction unions, trucking unions, restaurant workers' unions, and others operated under varying degrees of outfit influence. Lombardo was a key figure in maintaining and exploiting those relationships, ensuring that the financial flows from union activity continued to benefit outfit leadership, while the corruption remained sufficiently concealed to avoid triggering federal intervention. The casino skimming operations that connected Chicago to Las Vegas represented another major revenue stream that Lombardo was alleged to have been involved in facilitating. During the 1970s and early 1980s, several major Las Vegas casinos were controlled or heavily influenced by organized crime figures from Chicago and other cities. The skimming operation worked by removing cash from casino counting rooms before it was officially recorded. diverting it into channels that move money back to outfit leadership in Chicago without generating taxable income or traceable financial records. The operation required cooperation at multiple levels of casino management, reliable couriers, and organizational oversight to ensure that the money moved consistently and that the people involved remained loyal and silent. Federal investigators eventually penetrated those operations through a combination of surveillance, informants, and financial forensics, producing prosecutions that dismantled significant portions of the mob's Las Vegas infrastructure. Federal authorities alleged that Lombardo served as a critical link between upper outfit leadership and street-level crews, facilitating decisions that included sanctioned violence against individuals who posed threats to organizational security. Informants who cooperated with federal investigators described a decision-making process in which serious actions, including murders, required authorization from senior figures. Lombardo was identified in that testimony as someone whose approval or facilitation was relevant to specific acts of violence. The names and circumstances of those alleged victims were detailed in federal indictments that painted a picture of an organization that treated murder as an administrative tool, a mechanism for resolving problems that could not be addressed through other means. For years, federal prosecutors built their case against the Chicago outfit's surviving senior leadership with the methodical patience that complex organized crime prosecutions require. The investigation that eventually produced the most significant charges against Lombardo was known as Operation Family Secrets. It was one of the most ambitious federal prosecutions ever brought against the Chicago outfit, targeting a group of defendants that represented what remained of the organization's upper-tier leadership after decades of attrition through prosecution, death, and defection. The indictment alleged involvement in multiple murders spanning decades, racketeering, and a range of other serious criminal conduct. When the indictment was unsealed in 2005, Lombardo was among the primary defendants named. He did not surrender. At 76 years old, a senior figure in one of America's most storied criminal organizations made the decision to run. The FBI launched an extensive search operation. Investigators monitored known associates, surveilled locations connected to his history, and followed leads generated by informants and surveillance. For months, Lombardo remained hidden. The search attracted significant media attention, partly because of the inherent drama of a federal fugitive hunt, and partly because of the incongruity of the situation. A 76-year-old man, known publicly for theatrical confusion and clownish courtroom behavior, had successfully evaded one of the most capable law enforcement agencies in the world for an extended period. The clown, it turned out, was considerably more capable than the performance suggested. He was captured in early 2006 in a Chicago suburb, living quietly under circumstances that suggested careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. The capture confirmed what federal investigators had always maintained. The confusion was an act. The man behind it was disciplined, resourceful, and capable of executing a sustained disappearance that required genuine operational competence. When he was brought back into custody and processed through Cook County and federal detention facilities, the contrast between the theatrical figure from his public appearances and the reality of his situation was stark. He was a man facing charges that carried the possibility of spending the remainder of his life in federal prison. The trial that followed in 2007 was one of the most closely watched organized crime prosecutions in Chicago's history. Prosecutors presented decades of accumulated evidence, testimony from cooperating witnesses who had operated inside the outfit, financial records, surveillance recordings, and detailed accounts of the organization's structure and decision-making processes. The defense attempted to challenge the credibility of cooperating witnesses, many of whom had their own extensive criminal histories and had received benefits in exchange for their testimony. The jury deliberated and returned guilty verdicts on racketeering charges and involvement in multiple murders. Joey Lombardo was sentenced to life in federal prison. He died in custody in 2019 at the age of 90. The Clown Act had bought him decades of operational freedom and complicated numerous prosecutions over the years. It had not bought him the outcome he needed when the full weight of a determined federal prosecution finally arrived with sufficient evidence to overcome it. His story is a study in the relationship between performance and power, in how carefully constructed public personas can function as operational tools in criminal enterprises, and in the limits of even the most sophisticated deception when the evidence accumulated against it becomes overwhelming. Joey Lombardo spent his life performing harmlessness while facilitating serious harm. The performance was impressive. The record it was designed to conceal was not. Larry Hoover. Larry Hoover's story forces a question that does not have a comfortable answer. How much power can one man hold from inside a prison cell? Not theoretical power, not symbolic power, but operational power. The kind of power that moves narcotics across state lines, resolves internal disputes within a criminal organization, and shapes the daily decisions of thousands of people living on streets that the man giving the orders has not walked in decades. In Hoover's case, the answer that federal prosecutors presented to a jury in 1997, and that the evidence supported in exhaustive detail, was that the power was real, it was substantial, and it had continued operating long after the prison doors closed behind him. His story is not simply the story of a man who committed crimes and was punished for them. It is the story of what happens when an organization becomes so deeply identified with a single individual that removing that individual from the streets does not remove his influence from them. Larry Hoover was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1951 and moved to Chicago's South Side as a child, part of the broader migration of Black families from the rural South to northern industrial cities that reshaped the demographic landscape of places like Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland during the mid-20th century. The South Side neighborhoods where Hoover grew up were defined by the same concentrated conditions that shaped the West Side world Willie Lloyd inhabited. Poverty was structural and persistent. Housing was overcrowded and deteriorating. Economic opportunity was severely constrained by discriminatory practices in hiring, lending, and education that limited the pathways available to young men growing up in those communities. And gang structures were deeply embedded in the social fabric of those neighborhoods, offering identity, protection, income, and belonging to young men for whom the legitimate economy offered very little. Hoover became involved with street organization activity as a teenager, gravitating toward a group that would eventually become one of the most significant criminal organizations in Chicago's history. In 1969, at the age of 17, he and David Barksdale co-founded what became known as the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, later shortened to the Gangster Disciples. The founding of the organization reflected the particular moment in Chicago's gang history when larger umbrella alliances were forming, when organizations were developing more explicit hierarchies and written codes, and when the relationship between street organizations and the broader political and social movements of the late 1960s was creating new frameworks for how gang leadership understood and articulated their role in their communities. The Gangster Disciples developed a constitution, a set of written rules governing member conduct, a ranked hierarchy with defined titles and responsibilities, and an organizational identity that its founders presented, at least in part, as a response to the conditions of poverty and neglect that shaped the South Side. That framing would become one of the most contested aspects of Hoover's legacy. His supporters, and there were many of them, argued that the Gangster Disciples under his leadership represented something more complex than a simple criminal enterprise. They pointed to community programs, voter registration drives, and public statements from Hoover that emphasized economic development and political engagement as evidence that the organization had dimensions that went beyond drug dealing and violence. His critics and the federal prosecutors who built the case against him argued that the community programming was a facade, a public relations strategy designed to generate sympathy, complicate prosecutions, and recruit members by presenting the organization as a legitimate community institution rather than a criminal enterprise. The truth, as is often the case with figures of this complexity, contained elements of both perspectives without fully resolving into either. What is not contested is what happened in 1973. Hoover was 19 years old when he was convicted of murder in connection with the killing of a rival gang member named William Young. The circumstances of the killing were presented at trial as a direct product of the territorial violence that defined gang conflict on Chicago's South Side during that period. Hoover was sentenced to 150 to 200 years in Illinois State Prison. He was a teenager when he entered the Illinois Department of Corrections. Most people who understood the sentence expected it to function as it was designed to function, as a permanent removal of a dangerous individual from the streets of Chicago. What they did not anticipate was the degree to which Hoover would transform incarceration itself into a platform for expanding rather than diminishing his organizational authority. From inside Illinois state prisons, Hoover continued to function as the chairman of the Gangster Disciples. The title was not ceremonial. Federal prosecutors argued in exhaustive detail that it reflected a genuine operational role. Decisions about organizational direction, territorial disputes, financial management, and disciplinary matters were routed to Hoover through intermediaries who carried messages in and out of the prison system. Visitors to his cell were not simply family members maintaining personal connections, they were organizational representatives conducting business. Written communications that appeared innocuous on their surface contained coded instructions that governed operations on the streets of Chicago and, as the organization expanded, in cities across multiple states. The Gangster Disciples grew during the years of Hoover's incarceration into an organization with an estimated membership in the tens of thousands, operating drug distribution networks that generated millions of dollars annually and extended into Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, and beyond. The organizational structure that Hoover had built and continued to oversee from prison was described by federal investigators as genuinely sophisticated. There were ranks with specific titles. There were written codes of conduct that governed member behavior. There were financial systems for collecting dues, managing revenue from drug sales, and distributing money through the organization. There were enforcement mechanisms for punishing members who violated organizational rules, stole from the organization, or cooperated with law enforcement. And there was a communications infrastructure that connected street-level operations to mid-level supervisors, to senior leadership, and ultimately to Hoover himself, despite the physical barriers that prison was supposed to impose. The organization had, in the assessment of federal investigators, become a criminal enterprise of a scale and sophistication that placed it in a different category from conventional street gangs. Illinois state authorities eventually recognized that Hoover's continued influence from within the state prison system represented a problem that standard incarceration was not solving. His prison conditions were progressively restricted in attempts to limit his ability to communicate with and direct outside operations. Those restrictions produced legal challenges from Hoover's attorneys, who argued that the conditions of his confinement violated his constitutional rights. The legal battles over his prison conditions generated significant public attention and contributed to the broader public debate about his legacy and the nature of his continued influence. Supporters organized on his behalf, arguing that he had reformed, that he was using his influence to steer the organization away from violence, and that his continued harsh treatment was unjust given the changes he claimed to have undergone. Federal prosecutors were not persuaded. In 1995, a federal investigation produced a sweeping indictment targeting Hoover and dozens of associates on charges of running a continuing criminal enterprise, drug conspiracy, and related offenses. The evidence presented at trial was extensive and detailed. Cooperating witnesses described the organizational structure, the chain of command, and the specific ways in which Hoover's authority shaped operational decisions. Surveillance recordings captured conversations that prosecutors argued demonstrated his ongoing involvement in directing criminal activity. Financial records traced the movement of drug proceeds through the organization. The picture that emerged was of a man who had never stopped functioning as the operational head of a major criminal enterprise, regardless of the prison walls surrounding him. In 1997, Larry Hoover was convicted on federal charges of continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute cocaine, and related offenses. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms in federal prison. The sentence was designed to ensure that no future legal development, no parole board decision, no sentence reduction for good behavior could result in his release. He was subsequently transferred to the Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, known as ADX Florence, or the Federal Supermax, a facility designed specifically for inmates whose influence escape risk, or danger to others cannot be managed in standard federal prison environments. The conditions at ADX Florence are among the most restrictive in the American federal prison system. Inmates spend the vast majority of their time in individual cells with severely limited human contact and communication. His name has never fully left Chicago's streets. Debates about his legacy, his potential for rehabilitation, and the fairness of his sentence have resurfaced repeatedly over the decades. Advocacy campaigns calling for his release have attracted support from community members, activists, and public figures who argue that his continued incarceration serves no legitimate penological purpose and that the conditions of his confinement constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Federal authorities have consistently opposed those arguments, maintaining that the evidence of his continued organizational influence justifies the restrictions placed on him and that his release would pose a genuine public safety risk. What remains undisputed is that the organization he co-founded and led contributed to sustained violence, drug saturation, and cycles of retaliation across Chicago's South Side and beyond for generations. The communities most directly affected by Gangster Disciples activity were the same communities from which the organization drew its membership, the same South Side neighborhoods defined by concentrated poverty and limited opportunity that Hoover himself had grown up in. The relationship between the organization and those communities was not simply predatory. It was complex, layered, and in some respects genuinely reciprocal in ways that made the moral accounting difficult. But the violence was real. The drug distribution was real. The lives disrupted and ended by both were real. And the man at the center of the organizational structure that produced those outcomes spent decades directing that structure from a prison cell while the consequences played out on streets he could not see. Larry Hoover remains incarcerated at ADX Florence today. He is in his early 70s. The question of how one man's decisions from a prison cell shaped the lives of thousands of people on Chicago streets is one that criminologists, community advocates, law enforcement officials, and the families of people affected by Gangster Disciples activity continue to examine from perspectives that do not always align. That complexity is part of his story. It does not simplify it. It does not resolve it. It simply reflects the reality that the most consequential figures in the history of organized crime in America are rarely reducible to a single narrative, and that the full weight of what they set in motion is rarely contained within the boundaries of their own individual lives. 5 men, 5 different paths into the machinery of organized crime, 5 different expressions of what ambition looks like when it operates without restraint and without regard for the lives it consumes along the way. Al Capone built a corporate empire out of prohibition-era lawlessness and corrupted an entire city's institutional infrastructure in the process. Harry Alleman operated in deliberate silence, a precision instrument of violence whose case ultimately forced American courts to confront what happens when the justice system itself becomes the crime. Willie Lloyd commanded a West Side empire from a wheelchair after surviving assassination attempts that would have ended most men, building a legend out of endurance in a world that respects nothing more than the refusal to fall. Joey Lombardo spent decades hiding genuine power behind a performance of harmlessness, proving that in the world of organized crime, the most dangerous men are sometimes the ones who work hardest to appear unthreatening. And Larry Hoover demonstrated that physical incarceration and organizational authority are not the same thing, that a man can be removed from the streets while his influence continues to shape them in ways that outlast his own freedom. What connects these 5 men is not simply geography or the fact that Cook County Jail processed each of them at some point in their criminal histories. What connects them is the city itself. Chicago produced the conditions that made each of their rises possible. The concentrated poverty, the institutional corruption, the gaps between law and enforcement, the neighborhoods where legitimate opportunity was scarce, and organizational structures offered the only visible path to power and income. That is not an excuse for what any of these men did. The victims of their crimes, the families left behind, the communities hollowed out by the violence and drug distribution their organizations sustained, deserve better than an explanation that dissolves individual responsibility into structural conditions. But it is context, and context matters when you are trying to understand not just what happened, but why it kept happening, generation after generation, in the same city, in the same neighborhoods, through different organizations and different leaders, but with the same devastating consistency. Cook County Jail has processed hundreds of thousands of individuals across its history. Most of them are not names that appear in documentaries or federal case studies. Most of them are people caught in circumstances that the broader society has never fully committed to changing. The 5 men in this story are the exceptions, the ones whose crimes were consequential enough and whose organizational reach was extensive enough to generate the kind of historical record that makes storytelling like this possible. But they exist within a much larger story that Chicago is still writing. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Justice Docket if you have not already. Leave a comment with your thoughts on which of these 5 cases you found most compelling, and we will see you in the next one.